Ava Mitchell, an innocent 8-year-old, boarded the school bus daily, yet something sinister lurked beneath those routine rides. After enduring weeks of mounting fear and silence, Ava finally confided in her father the horrifying truth: the bus driver had acted up once more. What could have been so disturbing that her father immediately called? This narrative reveals a startling journey of bravery, justice, and a family's struggle to safeguard their daughter within a community that concealed dark secrets. Stay tuned as we explore this intense story of a mother's intuition, a father's urgent plea for assistance, and the community-shattering revelations that ensued. Additionally, please share where you're listening from, and if you appreciate this story, consider subscribing for more engaging narratives. Let's get started. The warm morning sun bathed Fairfax, Virginia, casting a golden hue over the peaceful streets of Maple Grove. The Mitchell family, Karen, Derek, and their 8-year-old daughter, Ava, watched a moving truck drive away from their front lawn. It was their first day in their new home, and the future seemed bright with possibilities. Ava, with her sparkling eyes and curly hair, hopped on her toes, eyeing the large oak tree in the yard. "Mom, can we put a swing on it?" Karen, smiling with a hint of nervousness, placed her hand on Ava's shoulder. "We'll see once we're settled in, sweetheart." Derek wiped the sweat from his forehead and laughed softly. "How about we celebrate with pizza tonight?" As they entered their new residence, they couldn't help but notice the curious stares from neighbors. They were the only black family on the street, possibly in the entire neighborhood. But Derek reassured his family, "We're here for better schools and safer streets. Ava deserves every chance." However, as Ava stood before the yellow school bus on her first day, Karen felt a deep unease, sensing that something wasn't right. The morning air was fresh as Karen stood on the sidewalk with Ava, watching the bright yellow bus turn the corner, its engine rumbling and breaking the suburban quiet. Ava's excitement was infectious. She held her new backpack tightly, her feet tapping with anticipation. It was her first day at Ridgewood Elementary, and though Karen was anxious, she focused on the positives. They had moved for a reason: better education and opportunities. As the bus neared, it emitted a long hiss as it stopped in front of them. The doors creaked open, revealing Mr. Thompson, the school's longtime bus driver. He appeared ordinary, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a face worn from years of driving. He donned a simple uniform and cap, exuding a grandfatherly presence that would typically reassure most parents. Yet, something about him seemed unsettling. His eyes met Karen's briefly, lingering longer than usual, and in that moment she sensed a flicker of something, perhaps surprise or judgment, that vanished as quickly as it came. He smiled at Ava, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome aboard," Mr. Thompson greeted in a polite yet detached tone. It was a greeting that felt rehearsed, lacking genuine warmth. Ava looked back at Karen for comfort. Karen forced a smile, waving to her daughter. "You'll do great," she called out. Ava beamed brightly, then skipped onto the bus, her curls bouncing with each step. As the doors closed with a groan, Karen felt her heart sink slightly. She couldn't explain it, but a sense of unease washed over her. She watched as the bus turned the corner and disappeared, Ava's face visible through the window, smiling with excitement. Her small hand waved enthusiastically, and Karen waved back. Yet, as the bus vanished from sight, the knot in her stomach tightened. Shaking her head, Karen dismissed the feeling. It was just nerves, she told herself. It was Ava's first day at a new school in a new neighborhood. Of course she'd feel anxious. Ava would make friends, adjust, and everything would be fine. But that odd look from the bus driver, it stayed with her. She replayed it repeatedly. Maybe she was overthinking it. Maybe it was just the stress of moving. Hours later, as the school day ended, Karen stood by the front window, eagerly awaiting the bus's return. She tried to keep busy by tidying the kitchen, but her eyes kept drifting to the clock. When she finally heard the engine outside, her heart leaped. Ava hopped off the bus with her usual energy, her curly hair flying as she ran up the driveway, her backpack bouncing against her small frame. Karen hurried to greet her at the door, her worry fading at the sight of Ava's bright smile. "How was your first day?" Karen asked, hugging Ava tightly. "It was awesome," Ava exclaimed, her voice full of excitement. She shared detailed stories about her day, the new friends, the cool playground, the fun teacher who handed out stickers for good behavior. Karen listened, feeling a wave of relief. Perhaps she had been overanalyzing. Ava seemed happy, and that was what mattered. However, as they sat at the kitchen table, snacking and organizing Ava's new school supplies, something Ava mentioned made Karen hesitate. "Our bus driver is kinda rude," Ava stated casually, reaching for a cookie. Karen's heart skipped a beat. "Rude?" she asked, trying to maintain a neutral tone. "What do you mean, sweetie?" Ava shrugged, appearing unaffected. "He doesn't really talk to anyone. He says things, but it's weird. I don't know. Maybe he's just grumpy." Karen's grip on the table edge tightened. "Did he say anything to you?" Ava thought for a moment before shaking her head. "Not really, just good morning, and sit down." She smiled, more interested in the cookies than the conversation. "It's not a big deal, Mom." But Karen couldn't dismiss the uneasy feeling that settled in her stomach. Not a big deal, she mused, yet the feeling persisted. Ava was a friendly and observant child, and her describing someone as rude suggested there was more to the story. Karen forced a smile and attempted to brush it off, but the worry gnawed at her. She watched Ava run off to play, her joy filling the house. Yet Karen's mind kept returning to Mr. Thompson. There was something in his morning glance that didn't feel right. Later that night, as she recounted Ava's day to Derek, her husband, Karen hesitated when mentioning the bus driver. She couldn't fully articulate what was troubling her. "Ava said the bus driver was rude," she murmured, observing Derek's reaction. Derek looked up from his phone, his brows knitting together. "Rude how?" "I don't know. She didn't say much, but I got this feeling," Karen replied, wringing her hands. "When I saw him this morning, he seemed off." Derek chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "Karen, it's probably nothing. Bus drivers deal with kids all day, they can be grumpy sometimes." Karen nodded, but internally, the unease continued to grow. Maybe Derek was right. Perhaps she was overthinking it. But deep down, something told her this wasn't merely about a grumpy bus driver. As days passed, Karen soon discovered her instincts were more accurate than she had imagined. In the ensuing weeks, the family settled into a routine. Derek left early for his job at Capital One in McLean, while Karen managed her home office. Initially, Ava was excited about school, sharing every detail of her day. However, her enthusiasm gradually waned. She responded with one-word answers when asked about school, and Karen noticed subtle changes in her behavior, avoiding eye contact and hesitating to discuss the bus rides. Karen attempted to encourage Ava to open up, but whenever she inquired about Mr. Thompson, Ava would shut down. One night, as Karen lay awake beside Derek, she whispered, "Something's wrong, Derek. Ava's not herself. I think it's related to the bus driver." Derek sighed, half asleep. "Karen, you're worrying too much. She's adjusting." But Karen's maternal instincts insisted otherwise. She decided to follow the bus herself. The next morning arrived gray and overcast, mirroring the growing weight in Karen's chest. She had barely slept, her mind clouded with doubts and fears about Ava's bus rides. Her unease intensified with each passing day, and now, as she watched Ava prepare for school, Karen made a decision, one that felt drastic but necessary. She was going to follow the bus. "Mom, why are you standing there with your keys?" Ava asked, her innocent eyes looking up at her. Karen snapped out of her trance, forcing a smile. "Just getting ready to run some errands, sweetheart." "Are you excited for school today?" Ava shrugged. "Yeah, I guess. It's just school." Karen kissed her daughter's forehead, then ushered her out the door. The yellow bus appeared at the end of the street, as it did every morning. But today, Karen's nerves were on edge. She gave Ava an encouraging wave as Mr. Thompson opened the doors, his neutral expression barely acknowledging them. Ava boarded, and Karen's heart raced with anxiety. Once the bus pulled away, Karen didn't hesitate. She jumped into her car, started the engine, and carefully followed, maintaining a safe distance. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, her pulse quickening with each turn the bus made. What was she doing? Was this crazy? Maybe Derek was right, perhaps she was overreacting, but deep down she knew something was wrong and couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in her gut. The bus made several stops along the suburban streets, picking up more children. Karen watched intently, her eyes shifting from house to bus, searching for anything unusual. Most kids boarded without issue, laughing and chatting. But then it happened. Just like every morning, Ava was always the last to board. Karen's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't noticed it before, but now it was glaringly obvious. Even when other children were waiting at the same stop, Ava was always the last to climb the steps. Why? What was Mr. Thompson saying to her? As Ava approached the bus steps, Karen leaned forward in her seat, squinting to see through the windshield. Her heart pounded as she watched Mr. Thompson mutter something under his breath. It wasn't loud enough to hear, but she saw Ava's shoulders tense. She hesitated for just a split second before climbing aboard. Karen's hands trembled on the steering wheel. What did he say? The question buzzed in her mind as she continued to follow the bus. Her eyes remained fixed on Mr. Thompson's movements as he made his final stops, dropping off kids at school. When they finally reached Ridgewood Elementary, Karen pulled over across the street, parking where she could still see the bus. She watched as the children exited one by one. When Ava stepped down, Mr. Thompson gave her a friendly pat on the shoulder, the gesture seeming innocent. But it made Karen's skin crawl. There was something too familiar, too calculated about it. She couldn't shake the feeling that this man was concealing something behind his thin facade of friendliness. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she watched Ava enter the school building, safe for the moment. Karen exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. But what now? She couldn't confront Mr. Thompson without any proof. All she had was a gut feeling, and Derek's words from last night echoed in her mind. "You're overreacting, Karen." Was she? The drive home felt interminable, her mind racing with possibilities. Maybe Mr. Thompson was just gruff. Perhaps she had misread his body language. Maybe Ava was simply experiencing normal first-week jitters. But deep down, Karen couldn't let it go. Something was wrong, and she couldn't ignore that instinct. That evening, when Derek returned from work, Karen was ready to confront him. She paced the kitchen as he removed his coat and set down his briefcase. "Derek, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice tense. He looked at her with a mix of concern and fatigue. "What's going on? You look stressed." Karen's hands fidgeted, her nerves taking over. "I followed the bus today." Derek's brows knitted in confusion. "You did what?" "I followed the bus," Karen repeated, her voice more assertive. "I saw how Mr. Thompson behaves around Ava. There's something off, Derek. I saw him mutter something under his breath as Ava boarded, and she looked so uncomfortable. He even gave her this strange pat on the shoulder when she got off." "It's not right." Derek stared at her, clearly trying to understand. Wait, hold on. You're telling me you followed the school bus all the way to the school?" "Karen, that sounds extreme." "Don't you think you might be overthinking this?" Karen's frustration surfaced. "I don't think I'm overthinking it. I'm telling you, Derek, something is wrong with that man. I can feel it. Ava isn't safe. I know it." Derek sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Karen, you've been stressed since we moved here. It's a new school, a new neighborhood. Ava's adjusting. You're adjusting. We all are. But following the bus? That's a bit much. Derek, you didn't see what I saw." Karen's voice cracked, her desperation evident. "Ava is always the last one to board, no matter where they stop." "Why? Why is she always last? And why does she tense up when he talks to her?" Derek shook his head, clearly tired of the conversation. Karen, you're overreacting. Maybe the guy's just grumpy. Maybe Ava's still getting used to the routine. You can't just assume the worst based on a feeling. Karen felt her throat tighten with frustration. I'm not assuming the worst. I'm trying to protect our daughter. But Derek, too weary to argue, gave her a long look before turning away. We'll discuss this later. I'm exhausted. As he left the room, Karen stood there, feeling a mix of anger, confusion, and helplessness. Why wouldn't he believe me? She thought. But deep down, she knew her instincts were correct. Ava wasn't safe, and she had to find a way to prove it before it was too late. Karen refused to give up. She couldn't. Her gut told her this was just the beginning, and her worst fears were yet to unfold. 2 weeks later, Ava didn't return home on time. Karen paced the living room, her heart racing. When Derek hurried home from work, he found Karen frantic, on the phone with the school and the bus depot. Finally, after 2 agonizing hours, Ava walked through the front door. Her hair was messy, her clothes wrinkled, and her face pale. Karen's relief swiftly turned to terror as she hugged Ava tightly. "Ava, where were you?" Karen asked, her voice trembling. Trembling, Ava looked up at her parents, tears welling in her eyes. "Mr. Thompson, he did it again." The world seemed to stand still. Derek's face lost all color. Karen's heart sank. "What did he do, baby?" Karen asked gently, kneeling to Ava's level. Ava's voice quivered as she revealed everything: how Mr. Thompson made racist remarks, how he left her stranded on the side of the road because her kind didn't belong in this neighborhood. It wasn't the first time. He had been tormenting her since her first week. Tears streamed down Karen's face. Derek stood in stunned silence. They had been oblivious to the truth. Now, they had to take action. The next morning, the sun rose, but it did nothing to alleviate the icy dread in Karen's chest. Sitting at the kitchen table, she felt Derek's tension as they dialed the Fairfax County Police Department. The call felt surreal. This was the moment to set everything in motion, but Karen couldn't shake the fear. Would anyone believe them? Would they believe Ava? When the police officers arrived at their home, Karen and Derek led them into the living room, explaining everything that had been happening with Mr. Thompson. The muttered comments, Ava's fear, the unsettling pattern of her always being the last aboard the bus. Ava sat quietly between them, clutching her mother's hand as Karen detailed the incidents, her voice wavering with emotion. "I've been driving kids for decades," Mr. Thompson said smugly when the officers confronted him. His hands rested calmly in his lap, his face masking innocence. "I would never hurt a child." Karen had expected him to deny everything, but hearing him speak with such casual arrogance infuriated her. He didn't even flinch when they mentioned Ava's story. He simply looked the officers in the eye and said, "You think I'd risk my reputation over something like this? There must be some misunderstanding." The officers took notes, their expressions unreadable, but Karen sensed their skepticism. She felt her heart sink as they politely concluded the interview, promising to look into it further. But Karen recognized that tone. She had heard it before. The subtle dismissal, the disbelief that Ava's word could outweigh the reputation of a man who had been a staple in the neighborhood for decades. Would Ava's voice be silenced? Would her family's pain be overlooked? As the officers departed, Karen sank back onto the couch, her hands trembling. "What if they don't believe us, Derek?" she whispered, tears filling her eyes. Derek, who had maintained his composure throughout the interview, finally exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "We did what we had to do. Now we wait." But waiting was excruciating. Days slipped by, and the tension within the Mitchell household grew oppressive. Each day that passed without any updates from the police further shattered Karen's fragile hope. Ava remained silent, withdrawing into herself. Although the bus driver had been temporarily reassigned, Karen could sense that Ava still felt unsafe. Then, an unexpected event unfolded. One afternoon, while Karen was shopping at the grocery store, she heard her name called softly. Turning around, she saw Mrs. Taylor, one of the few other black mothers in the neighborhood, standing near the produce section. Her face showed a blend of uncertainty and determination. "I heard about what's going on," Mrs. Taylor said quietly. She glanced around cautiously, as if ensuring no one else was listening. "Karen, I think it's time I shared something with you." Karen's heart raced as Mrs. Taylor continued, revealing that her own children had also fallen victim to Mr. Thompson's cruel actions. Unlike Ava, Mrs. Taylor's children had been too scared to speak out. The fear of retaliation and the belief that no one would believe them had kept them silent. "I should have spoken up earlier," Mrs. Taylor confessed, her eyes filled with remorse. "But I was frightened. I didn't want to cause trouble. We just started driving our kids to school ourselves. But now I realized that wasn't sufficient." A surge of hope mixed with anger washed over Karen. She wasn't alone. Ava wasn't alone. "Will you go to the police?" Karen asked softly. Mrs. Taylor nodded. "Yes, I'm done staying silent." That evening, Karen and Derek met with the police once more, this time accompanied by Mrs. Taylor. Her testimony supported everything Ava had endured. The officers, who had initially seemed doubtful, began to take their allegations seriously. As Mrs. Taylor's account spread throughout the neighborhood, something remarkable occurred. Gradually, more families stepped forward. Initially, it was quiet murmurs, parents mentioning vague instances of rude comments or odd behavior from Mr. Thompson. But as these whispers grew louder, they collectively depicted a man who had long concealed his true nature behind a respected reputation, mistreating children too frightened to speak up. The momentum began to shift. The community's unwavering trust in Mr. Thompson started to crumble. Karen couldn't believe it. The relief she felt was immense, but so was the outrage. How had this situation persisted for so long? How many children had suffered in silence? The investigation gained momentum. More officers joined the effort, and it became evident that Mr. Thompson's misconduct had gone unnoticed for years. The pressure built until the day arrived. Mr. Thompson was arrested. Karen and Derek were sitting in their living room when the phone rang. An officer informed them that Mr. Thompson had been taken into custody. The relief was overwhelming, but their fight was far from over. As news of Mr. Thompson's arrest spread, the Mitchell family found themselves at the center of a media frenzy. Journalists swarmed their front yard, camera crews set up on the street, and reporters bombarded them with questions whenever Karen or Derek stepped outside. The headlines were harsh and sensational. "Racist bus driver terrorizes black child in Fairfax." Karen felt her stomach twist each time she saw her family's story in the news, their pain reduced to a few shocking words. The cameras, the lights, the relentless questions, it was all too much. But she understood why they were there. She knew that their story, Ava's story, had ignited something greater. One evening, after the media had left for the day, Karen stood by the front window, gazing into the darkened street. Derek joined her, his expression tired but determined. "This isn't just about Mr. Thompson anymore," Karen said softly. "It's about more than that. It's about ensuring no child has to endure what Ava did." Derek nodded. "We have to keep fighting, not just for Ava, but for all of them." The next day, they attended a community meeting at Fairfax County Public Schools, along with other parents who had shared similar stories. The room was filled to capacity, the tension thick in the air. Angry voices echoed as parents demanded explanations from school officials. "We trusted you to keep our children safe," one parent shouted. "Why wasn't this addressed sooner?" another yelled. Karen stood up, her voice calm yet resolute. "This is about more than one bus driver. It's about establishing a system where our children feel safe, where they can speak up without fear of being ignored." The room fell silent as Karen's words resonated. The school board was compelled to act. Cameras were installed on all school buses. Cultural sensitivity training became mandatory for all staff, and a new anonymous reporting system was introduced. The community, once divided, began to unite. As days turned into weeks, Karen recognized that the path ahead would be long. Healing was still necessary for Ava, her family, and the other children affected, but they had won the initial battle. They had spoken out and been heard. With Mr. Thompson now behind bars awaiting trial, Karen allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had fought for her daughter and would continue to fight for every child who had ever felt powerless. They were no longer powerless. As Mr. Thompson's trial approached, Ava's bravery was tested. Karen and Derek grappled with the idea of Ava having to testify, reliving her trauma before strangers. However, with the support of her therapist, Ava found her voice. Her testimony, along with others, sealed Mr. Thompson's fate. He was convicted and sentenced, but the struggle was not over. Karen and Derek became advocates for change in their community. The Fairfax County School Board implemented new policies, installing cameras on buses, introducing cultural sensitivity training, and creating an anonymous reporting system to ensure no child would have to endure what Ava did. Months had passed since the turmoil that had upended their lives. The harsh winter winds had subsided, and as spring blossomed across Fairfax, Karen Mitchell stood on her front porch, basking in the warm sunlight. The air was fragrant with blooming flowers, and the streets felt calmer, more peaceful. Before her, the yellow school bus pulled up to the curb, but this time, Karen felt no fear. The doors creaked open, and a kind-faced woman with warm brown eyes greeted the children from the driver's seat. Ms. Daniels, a gentle-voiced woman of color, had taken over the route, bringing a welcome change for both Karen and Ava. As she welcomed the children boarding the bus, her energy was the opposite of the cold indifference they had experienced with Mr. Thompson. Ava turned back from the top of the bus steps, her face lighting up with a bright smile as she waved at her mother. Karen waved back, her heart swelling with pride. Ava's spirit had been restored, her smile genuine, her laughter free from fear. She stood taller, her confidence gradually returning, and Karen couldn't help but admire her daughter's resilience. Ava took her seat beside her friends, a diverse group of children who chatted animatedly as the bus pulled away from the curb. Karen remained on the porch, watching until the bus disappeared around the corner, the warm breeze gently tousling her hair. She exhaled deeply, releasing a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The journey had been arduous. There were nights when Karen cried herself to sleep, overwhelmed by the weight of everything her family had endured. She faced doubt, fear, and anger, from within her own home and from community members who had initially refused to believe their story. But standing there now, as the spring sun illuminated the world, she knew they had emerged stronger. Karen and Derek had fought not only for Ava, but for every child who had been silenced or mistreated. They had challenged a system that had tried to ignore them, and they had succeeded. The fight for justice had been tough. There were moments when they nearly gave up, when the burden felt too heavy. But they weren't alone. Support from other families, from Mrs. Taylor and those who had come forward, had made all the difference. Now Fairfax was evolving. The school board had implemented significant reforms, installing cameras on buses, establishing better systems for reporting issues, and mandating diversity training for all staff. Parents, both black and white, had united to form a diversity and inclusion committee, which Karen and Derek joined. The meetings, once filled with tension, were now dedicated to creating a better, safer environment for all children. As Karen walked back into the house, she found Derek at the kitchen table, reading the morning newspaper. He looked up and smiled. "How's Ava this morning?" "She's good," Karen replied, sitting beside him. "She waved at me before getting on the bus. It feels different now." Derek nodded thoughtfully. "It does, doesn't it? We've come a long way." Karen placed her hand over his, squeezing gently. "We have. But I feel like there's still more to do." "There is," Derek agreed, his eyes reflecting the same determination she felt. "But we'll do it, together." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both reflecting on their journey. The media frenzy that had once consumed their lives had subsided, though occasionally they still saw news stories about Mr. Thompson's trial. He had been convicted, thanks to the testimonies of several families, and would never drive a school bus again. Justice had been served, but Karen knew the emotional scars would take time to heal. One afternoon, a few weeks after the trial, Karen took Ava to a therapist specializing in helping children cope with trauma. It had been challenging for Ava initially, opening up about her feelings, reliving those painful moments, but gradually the sessions helped her process what had happened. Karen had been by her side every step of the way, watching as Ava regained her sense of safety and joy. "I'm proud of you, Karen said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "You've been so brave, Ava." Ava looked up at her mother, her eyes thoughtful. "I just didn't want him to hurt anyone else," she said softly. "I knew what he did was wrong, but I was scared that no one would believe me." Karen's heart ached at those words, but she smiled, brushing a stray curl from Ava's face. "We believed you, and because of you, other kids will be safe now." Ava nodded, a quiet strength in her expression. "I know, Mom. I'm glad we stood up for what was right." As spring transitioned into summer, the Mitchell family began to heal. The memories of those dark days remained, but they no longer held the same power. Karen watched as Ava laughed freely with her friends, no longer burdened by fear. She saw Derek becoming more involved with the community, joining efforts to ensure lasting change. Together, they had found a new purpose, rooted in ensuring that no other family had to endure what they had gone through. One afternoon, Karen received a knock at the door. It was Sarah Harper, the neighbor who had once lashed out at her in the park. Sarah stood there, her expression softened, eyes lowered. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I was wrong to dismiss you, to treat you the way I did. I didn't understand, but I see things differently now. I'm sorry." For a moment, Karen was at a loss for words. She had harbored so much anger toward Sarah after that encounter, but seeing the vulnerability in her eyes, she took a deep breath and stepped forward, extending her hand. "Thank you," Karen said steadily. "It means a lot that you came here." It wasn't an immediate reconciliation, but it was a step, a small gesture of healing, demonstrating how far the community had come and how much more was possible. As the months went by, Karen felt increasingly optimistic. Challenges remained: systemic racism, inequality, and the ongoing need for vigilance, but there was also a sense of hope. The school had implemented new policies. The community was more united, and Karen and Derek had become advocates for change. On a sunny afternoon in May, Karen stood on the porch once more, watching as Ava boarded the school bus, chatting animatedly with her friends. The air was filled with the sounds of children's laughter, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. Karen smiled, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. She knew there were more battles ahead, more work to be done to create a truly inclusive and safe community. But in that moment, as she watched Ava's bus pull away, she allowed herself to feel hope. Hope for a future where every child, regardless of their skin color, could feel safe, valued, and heard. And in that hope, Karen found strength. Weeks later, Karen opened the door to find Mrs. Harper, the neighbor who had initially lashed out at her, standing on her porch. Her eyes were downcast. "I owe you an apology," she said softly. Karen hesitated but then extended her hand. "Thank you for saying that." It was a small step, but Karen knew it was part of something bigger. They had begun to change not just their lives, but their community. And as long as they stayed strong, they could continue to fight for justice, for Ava, and for every child like her. What are your thoughts on Ava's story? If you were in her parents' shoes, how would you have handled the situation? And what steps do you think communities can take to ensure no child ever feels unsafe again? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more narratives like these. See you in the next video.